Beneath the ashes of the Second World War lies a shadow history, buried files, erased names, missions never spoken of. What we inherit are fragments, crates that vanished without record, signals that whispered long after their senders were gone, blueprints spirited away across oceans. These are the ghosts of a war that refused to end, where silence was weaponized and truth itself became contraband. Step closer, and the past begins to resist being forgotten. On April 22, 1945, as American armored columns pressed south through Bavaria, a transport convoy was intercepted near the town of Garmisch-Partenkirchen. The unit, attached to the 3rd Infantry Division, recorded the seizure of 6 sealed wooden crates, each stenciled with the words Projekt Morgenrot, Project Dawn. According to field logs later recovered, the convoy had been abandoned by retreating Wehrmacht troops, the drivers executed along the roadside in what appeared to be an internal purge. The crates were taken under custody by an OSS liaison team attached to the division, then quietly removed from the inventory reports before the division reached Munich. Eyewitnesses recall the unusual precautions surrounding the cargo. Private Harold Niven, who gave a deposition decades later, described guards in civilian suits and black gloves sealing the trucks, refusing to allow army engineers to inspect the contents. He remembered faint humming from inside one of the containers, like a dynamo or an electric motor left running. Though no one could confirm whether the sound was mechanical or imagined under stress. Within 48 hours, the crates were on a rail transport headed for Frankfurt am Main under OSS escort. They never arrived. The official shipping manifest, dated April 25, 1945, lists the cargo as scientific instrumentation, priority clearance. A marginal note indicates the crates were transferred at Augsburg to a secure car on train 47B, destination Frankfurt. Yet the records of Frankfurt station for that day contain no reference to the shipment, nor to the arrival of any OSS freight. A week later, OSS headquarters filed an internal memorandum acknowledging the material was temporarily unaccounted for, but no follow-up appears in the archives. By May, the war in Europe was over, and the paperwork trail goes cold. Fragments of what Projekt Morgenrot might have entailed began surfacing in scattered declassified files. A captured German engineer, Otto Fleischer, interrogated at Camp King near Oberursel, mentioned a propulsion system designed for long-range U-boats, employing field displacement rather than conventional diesel-electric power. He described cylindrical housings with high-voltage capacitors, allegedly capable of reducing underwater drag. The interrogators dismissed the claims as exaggeration, but his statements were quietly attached to the missing crates dossier. Another lead came from a 1952 CIA briefing prepared for the Joint Atomic Energy Intelligence Committee. In a paragraph, redacted for decades, analysts noted rumors of a German circular airframe project tied to Morgenrot, involving stress-resistant alloys and non-aerodynamic shapes. The report was careful to emphasize that no evidence survived, only speculation, pieced together from defectors and fragmentary files. Still, the suggestion that the vanished crates might have contained not submarine engines but components for an experimental aircraft has fueled debate among historians and conspiracy researchers alike. The mystery deepened in 1968 when French intelligence declassified a wartime interrogation of a Luftwaffe signals officer captured near Reims. The officer referenced a shipment of Red Dawn equipment evacuated from Peenemünde in late 1944, relocated by rail to southern Germany. He insisted the project was overseen not by the Luftwaffe, but by a shadow office within the Reich Ministry for Armaments under Albert Speer, known only as the Sondergruppe G. No further documentation of this group has ever been uncovered. Soviet archives contain their own peculiar silences. KGB files opened briefly in the 1990s show that Moscow was aware of the disappearance of the crates. A decrypted intercept from May 1945 recorded NKVD officers complaining that the Americans have taken the Sunrise cargo, likely referencing Morgenrot, yet no captured Soviet documents provide a description of the contents. Some researchers suspect the crates were transferred through Operation Paperclip channels to the United States, concealed among legitimate shipments of rocket parts and jet engines. Others argue they were diverted to the Soviet Union through clandestine agreements. At the war's end, both theories remain unproven. In 1978, a retired Army colonel, James Alder, gave a taped interview for an oral history project. He had served as a young lieutenant in the OSS European Theatre. Without naming Morgenrot, he recalled escorting a shipment of boxes, 6 in number, out of Bavaria. He insisted the cargo never reached Frankfurt. Instead, he claimed, it was rerouted to an airfield outside Stuttgart, loaded onto a C-54 Skymaster, and flown directly to Washington National Airport. According to Alder, the boxes were immediately transported under heavy guard to a warehouse facility in Maryland. His statement, however, has never been corroborated by flight logs or manifests. By the early 21st century, Morgenrot had become a ghost in the archives, a reference without evidence. Freedom of Information Act requests to the CIA and Department of Defense have returned heavily redacted files, often with entire pages blanked out. The only surviving piece of physical evidence comes from a customs logbook in Augsburg, dated April 25, 1945, noting the transfer of 6 oversized crates, dimensions inconsistent with standard cargo, aboard train 47B. That entry remains the last verifiable trace. Military archivists continue to debate the implications. Was Morgenrot simply another of the Reich's many dead-end technological fantasies, lost to chaos and later mythologized? Or was it something substantial, a prototype that vanished before Allied engineers could evaluate it? The precision with which the crates disappeared, the absence of wreckage, the silence of paperwork, the lack of any surviving eyewitnesses beyond vague recollections, suggests deliberate concealment rather than accident. Today, in the storage rooms of the National Archives, one can still find file 77329MR, stamped Missing Cargo, Bavaria, April 1945. It contains only 3 documents: the initial field log recording the seizure of the crates, the Augsburg customs notation, and the OSS memorandum acknowledging the loss. The rest is gone, missing, destroyed, or locked away under deeper classification. What remains is absence. The shadow of 6 boxes that passed through war-torn Germany for less than a week, then vanished into history. Whether they contained submarine engines, exotic aircraft parts, or nothing more than scrap metal, no one has ever proven. What is certain is that their disappearance was neither random nor accidental, but carefully orchestrated at a moment when the world's future hung in the balance. In December 1959, the British Foreign Office circulated a classified memorandum marked COS 59-217. The document referred to unusual radio transmissions emanating from the Carpathian Mountains, specifically a region near the Slovak-Ukrainian border. The signals, intercepted by RAF Chiksans, followed a pattern of coded bursts resembling Wehrmacht Enigma traffic. Analysts initially suspected Warsaw Pact deception, but further review revealed the signals used frequency bands consistent with late-war German listening stations. The report labeled the origin point as Station Grau, Grey Station, though no official record of such a facility existed in Allied wartime files. The broadcasts were not continuous. They emerged at irregular intervals, always between 0200 and 0400 hours, transmitting strings of numbers that repeated 3 times before cutting to static. Linguistic analysis suggested a numeric cipher system once used by the Abwehr. Yet by 1960, the Abwehr had been dissolved for 15 years, its archives scattered or destroyed. The implications disturbed British intelligence. Either remnants of the German apparatus had survived in hiding, or another power had deliberately reconstructed its systems. The first mission to investigate was dispatched in February 1961 under MI6 supervision. The unit consisted of 2 field officers and 3 local guides recruited in Bratislava. Their objective was to locate the source of the transmission within the remote valleys south of Rakiv. Field notes recovered later indicate they entered the region during a heavy snowstorm and established contact with villagers in the hamlet of Yasinia. Locals reported hearing foreign voices on crude radios since the late 1940s, often accompanied by flickering lights above the ridgelines. The team ascended into the mountains on March 3rd. They never returned. The only surviving document from the mission is a half-completed signal report transmitted at 03:14 hours on March 4th, 1961. The text reads, "Entering tunnel complex. Evidence of..." The line breaks off abruptly. Soviet Border Patrol logs from that night mention hearing distant gunfire, though no bodies were ever recovered. MI6 quietly closed the file, declaring the team lost to environmental exposure. Internally, however, the Foreign Office circulated a warning that Station Grau remains active, personnel status unresolved. The Soviets denied all knowledge, yet declassified KGB memoranda from 1992 reveal that Moscow too had tracked the transmissions since 1947. Their analysts concluded the broadcasts were generated by an automated relay system buried in the Carpathians. One file references a sealed tunnel installation, reinforced concrete, access destroyed by explosives. Consistent with descriptions from local folklore about wartime German engineers blasting caves shut as the Red Army advanced. Soviet teams reportedly attempted excavation in 1950, but abandoned the effort after 3 collapses killed 12 miners. The KGB suspected the British disappearance in 1961 was the result of tampering with these unstable ruins. What exactly Station Grau transmitted remains uncertain. Decrypted fragments of the numeric codes recovered by GCHQ in 1962 yielded the phrase Schwarze Kapelle, Black Chapel, a known Nazi codename for internal resistance circles within the Wehrmacht. Whether the broadcasts referenced these groups or were decoys is unclear. Another sequence translated loosely into map coordinates in northern Poland, near the former Wolf's Lair headquarters. Analysts speculated the transmissions were residual instructions to sleeper agents, though no evidence of active networks survived the war's end. Adding to the enigma, villagers in Yasinia recalled an influx of German officers in 1944, months before the Soviet advance. They commandeered an abandoned monastery, bringing trucks laden with equipment covered by tarps. The officers reportedly worked day and night, installing cables into the mountain slopes. When the Red Army arrived, the monastery was gone. Its walls collapsed, its underground passages sealed with concrete. Locals swore they heard machinery humming beneath the ground for years afterward, long after the Germans had vanished. During the brief period of East German archive access in 1990, researchers uncovered a fragmentary file from the Ministry for State Security referencing Projekt Nebelspitze. The project, linked to SS intelligence, detailed construction of high-frequency transmitters in concealed mountain sites, intended as fallback communication centers if Berlin fell. Most were incomplete or destroyed before activation, but the Carpathian facility, codenamed Station Grau, appeared operational as late as May 1945. Its task: maintain coded contact with dispersed units until higher command could reassert control. No record shows such control was ever re-established, raising the question of why transmissions continued for decades. Today, the location of Station Grau remains uncertain. Aerial reconnaissance conducted by NATO in the 1970s identified several collapsed tunnel systems in the Rakiv district, but no conclusive evidence of surviving transmitters. The signals ceased in 1967, with one final broadcast lasting 42 minutes. Analysts who studied the tape noted an unusual tonal modulation, unlike previous number sequences. Some believed it to be a pre-recorded voice loop, but the poor quality prevented clear identification. After that night, the airwaves fell silent. The absence of closure has fueled decades of speculation. Was Station Grau truly an automated relic of the Third Reich, still echoing orders to soldiers long dead? Or was it repurposed during the Cold War by Soviet intelligence as a tool of misdirection, designed to lure Western agencies into fruitless hunts? The disappearance of the 1961 MI6 team remains the most haunting clue. 5 men swallowed by the owl. Mountains leaving behind only a broken radio message, evidence of, in the archives of GCHQ, the file still exists under restricted classification. Grey Station, Carpathian Broadcasts, 1947-1967. It contains reels of static, strings of meaningless numbers, and photographs of barren ridgelines. For intelligence officers who have studied it, the unease lies not in what is preserved, but in what is missing. A voice that should not have spoken, continuing long after its masters had perished, then vanishing without explanation into the silence of history. On the night of May 19, 1944, as Allied commanders finalized the Normandy invasion plans, a smaller and lesser-known mission was launched across the Baltic Sea. Codenamed Operation Haversack, it involved a joint detachment of British Special, Operations Executive, SOE, and Polish Home Army veterans trained in sabotage and deep infiltration. Their target was the island of Rügen, off Germany's northern coast, where intelligence suggested the Wehrmacht had stockpiled experimental chemical warheads designed for rocket deployment. Though overshadowed by larger campaigns, the operation was deemed critical. If the warheads were real, they represented a direct threat to the coming invasion. The plan was drawn up in secrecy by SOE Section X, the branch handling unconventional warfare. Documents declassified in 1975 indicate that 14 men embarked from Scapa Flow aboard HMS Plymouth, a modified destroyer. They carried silenced Sten guns, demolition charges, and British-made lightweight respirators. Among them was Captain Antoni Lisowski, a veteran of the Warsaw Underground whose reports had first flagged the Rügen stockpile months earlier. The task force landed under darkness on the island's southern shore near the village of Putbus. Initial radio logs captured by Bletchley Park confirmed that the team landed successfully at 23:47 hours. The first signal, transmitted on the call sign Haversack 1, reported, "Beach secured, no enemy contact, advancing to objective." 2 hours later, a second message read, "Structures located, heavy guard presence, evidence of chemical storage drums." That was the last confirmed transmission. No further signals were received. By dawn, Rügen appeared silent, with no Allied aircraft reporting signs of engagement. German records later uncovered paint a grim picture. A Wehrmacht garrison report dated May 20th refers obliquely to sudden enemy intrusion at Depot Sud, neutralized, without survivor. Yet the language is unusual. Rather than describing combat, it notes material contained compromised, destruction authorized by Berlin. Within 48 hours, Luftwaffe demolition squads had detonated the facility. Photographs taken by reconnaissance flights show a series of scorched bunkers and cratered ground where structures had stood. Whatever the commandos found inside, it was obliterated before Allied intelligence could examine it. Survivor rumors began almost immediately. Soviet NKVD files opened in the 1990s reference testimony from civilians on the island who witnessed foreign soldiers being marched under guard into trucks bound for the mainland. One woman, interviewed in 1946, described hearing Polish speech among the prisoners. Another recalled that the guards wore black SS uniforms rather than regular Wehrmacht attire. If true, the commandos may not have been killed outright, but captured. What became of them after is unknown. No Allied prisoners from Haversack were ever repatriated. The chemical warheads themselves remain an enigma. A fragmentary document recovered from the German Army Ordnance Office, dated April 1944, outlines a program labeled N-Stoffkörper, involving nerve agents more advanced than tabun or sarin. Unlike earlier compounds, these were allegedly designed for aerial dispersal via rocket artillery. The Rügen depot, listed simply as Sudepo, was tasked with housing the first batch before operational testing. Whether the weapons were completed remains uncertain. Soviet post-war accounts insist the site was empty when they arrived in 1945, though the scorched bunkers suggest otherwise. British intelligence quietly buried the operation's existence. By late June, an internal SOE memorandum classified Haversack as mission cancelled, no action. Files relating to the raid were sealed until 1974, and even then, heavily redacted. The families of the missing men received only vague notices, stating they had been killed in action during special duties in Northern Europe. No graves were ever identified. Captain Lisowski's name does not appear on official Polish Home Army rolls, as if erased from record. His family in Krakow received no word beyond a single telegram. Antoni fell among comrades, duty fulfilled. Speculation intensified in the decades that followed. Some researchers argue the mission was a decoy, designed to distract German forces from Normandy. Others believe it uncovered weapons so dangerous that both sides sought to erase their traces. A 1951 CIA report, released only in part, references Haversack survivors transferred eastward. The line was struck through by a censor's pen, leaving the destination unclear. Some suspect the men were taken to Soviet laboratories. There, knowledge of Allied sabotage techniques too valuable to ignore. Eyewitness accounts from Soviet soldiers who reached Rugin in May 1945 add another layer. A corporal from the Second Belarusian Front wrote in his diary of burned tunnels with chemical stink, masks issued to all men. He noted signs of collapsed storage vaults, charred remains of drums, and strange symbols on walls, skulls within triangles. His entry ends abruptly. Commissar ordered silence. This place not to be spoken of. The diary was found decades later in a Moscow flea market, smuggled west by collectors. Its authenticity has never been disproven. If the Commandos had indeed discovered advanced chemical weapons, their disappearance ensured the truth would remain hidden. No subsequent Allied investigation has confirmed the warhead's existence. Some argue they were destroyed along with the depot. Others suspect they were secretly evacuated, spirited away in the war's final chaos. The fact that German records acknowledge their destruction suggests something tangible was lost. Whether the Haversack team lived long enough to see it remains unknown. Today, the story of Operation Haversack exists only in fragments, half-redacted reports, scorched aerial photographs, and whispers from declassified Soviet files. No bodies, no graves, no weapons recovered. The silence is itself a clue. For a mission so dangerous, so potentially catastrophic, history has been written as if it never occurred. The men who set foot on Rugin that May night vanished not only into the Baltic fog, but into the blank spaces of the archive, where wars are remembered not by what happened, but by what was erased. In the years immediately following the collapse of the Third Reich, Argentina became a haven for fleeing German officers, industrialists, and scientists. Much has been written about Operation Odessa and the smuggling of war criminals across the Atlantic, but declassified CIA intercepts from 1948 suggest that the Condor route was more than an escape line. According to memoranda marked restricted for eyes only, the route also carried cargo far more valuable than men. Blueprints and prototypes of German weapons never deployed on the battlefield. Among them was a device referenced only as the Sturmkanone, an electromagnetic artillery system capable of firing projectiles at supersonic velocities without the use of explosives. The first mention of the Sturmkanone appears in an intercepted letter between two former Reich engineers dated June 1946, seized in Marseille by French counterintelligence. The letter, encoded with a simple substitution cipher, referenced cylinders en route to Buenos Aires and arrangements with the admiral. Analysts at the time assumed the cylinders contained currency or forged documents for escapees. Only later did cross-referenced files suggest the term was used to describe metal housings for prototype weapon components. The admiral named in the letter has never been conclusively identified, though some believe it referred to Admiral Karl Dönitz, whose rumored involvement in post-war evacuation networks remains a subject of controversy. In Buenos Aires, the trail grew darker. Argentine police reports from September 1952 describe a warehouse fire in the dockside district of La Boca. The blaze consumed an entire block of storage facilities, including one that neighbors claimed was guarded nightly by armed men with German accents. The official report lists the cause as electrical malfunction, yet local witnesses recalled trucks unloading sealed crates into the building days before the fire. One man swore the containers were marked with German military stencils, including an eagle insignia partially blackened out. All records from the warehouse owner disappeared in the fire. Declassified CIA cables reveal that Washington had suspicions about the incident. A field officer in Buenos Aires wrote that the destroyed warehouse had been under surveillance for 3 months. He noted repeated visits by engineers using false Argentine passports, but speaking fluent German among themselves. At least 2 were later identified as former employees of the Krupp armaments conglomerate. The cable concluded suspected transfer of technical schematics, possible Sturmkanone blueprints, evidence destroyed in conflagration, recommend containment, no publics, disclosure. The last line was underlined twice. Survivors of the escape networks lend further weight. In 1960, an informant known only as Schreiber, debriefed in West Germany, claimed he had worked as a courier along the Condor route. He described transporting large metal tubes through Genoa to a waiting vessel bound for South America. When pressed about their contents, he answered simply, "Power without powder. They said it would change the world." His testimony was dismissed at the time as exaggeration, but a note in the file indicates MI6 requested copies of the transcript for their archives. The political context explains why the truth may have been buried. Argentina, under President Juan Perón, actively sheltered former Nazis, valuing their technical expertise. At the same time, both the United States and the Soviet Union were racing to capture German scientists for their own weapons programs. Public disclosure that blueprints had slipped away to South America would have undermined Allied claims of complete technological seizure. Silence was more convenient, allowing intelligence services to quietly monitor the situation without raising alarm. What became of the Sturmkanone remains unresolved. Some accounts suggest it was never more than a theoretical design, abandoned under the stress of war. Others argue that crude prototypes were successfully tested in late 1944 near the Baltic coast. A 1957 US Air Force intelligence report, partially declassified in 2002, notes unexplained ballistic signatures detected during rocket tracking flights off the Argentine coast. The report speculates these could have been experimental railgun-type devices fired at sea, though the conclusion is blacked out. No photographs or physical evidence survive. The Condor route itself dissolved by the mid-1950s as Argentine politics shifted and international pressure mounted, yet traces of its cargo resurface occasionally. In 1965, Israeli agents investigating fugitive war criminals in Cordoba uncovered a collection of technical drawings hidden inside a false wall. The sketches depicted electrical coil arrays and barrel-like structures labeled ESK-3. The documents were quietly transferred to Tel Aviv, never released publicly. Whether they represented genuine Sturmkanone blueprints or merely engineering fantasies is unknown. Today, Argentine archives contain little mention of the warehouse fire, the German engineers, or the seized cylinders. Files remain classified under national security, inaccessible even to local historians. In Washington, requests for Condor route materials continue to return with heavily redacted pages. What survives are fragments, an intercepted letter, a burned warehouse, anonymous testimony, and a handful of suspicious drawings. None prove the existence of the weapon, yet none entirely dismiss it. If the Sturmkanone ever existed, it now resides in silence, its blueprints scattered, its prototypes destroyed, its legacy reduced to rumor. But the story of the Condor route is more than one weapon. It is a reminder of how wars do not end neatly with surrender. Technologies, secrets, and ambitions travel across borders, carried in crates, in letters, in whispers. Somewhere along the docks of Buenos Aires, in the ashes of a warehouse fire, lies the closest trace of a weapon that history refuses to confirm, but cannot fully erase. In January 1991, during the chaotic weeks following the fall of the Berlin Wall, Archivists at the East German Ministry of State Security uncovered a rusted metal reel canister mislabeled Bauakten 1953. Inside was a deteriorating 16mm film, later catalogued only as Nachtjäger film. The footage ran just under 6 minutes. What it showed was so extraordinary that within days it was quietly removed from the public record and transferred under armed guard to Moscow. Only one still frame survived in the archives, copied in haste by a technician before the reel vanished again. The surviving testimonies from those who viewed the film described night tests of a German twin fuselage interceptor aircraft, unrecognizable from known Luftwaffe designs. The craft, allegedly designated Nachtjägerprojekt 46, appeared to mount two parallel bodies joined by a reinforced central wing. Eyewitness notes described an absence of propellers and a distinctive roar like steam escaping under pressure. Experts consulted years later identified the silhouette as consistent with advanced jet or rocket propulsion, at least a decade ahead of its time. Yet no such aircraft appears in surviving Luftwaffe inventories, even in the most speculative late-war projects. The provenance of the film suggests it was seized in Prague in May 1945, when Soviet forces captured abandoned Luftwaffe and SS intelligence officers. A catalogue entry found in Moscow's Central Archive refers to one technical reel, Aviation Experimental, received Prague May 12th. No corresponding record exists in Western intelligence files, although US forces were simultaneously combing through German aerospace facilities under Operation Lusty. The absence of mention in American archives has fueled suspicion that the Soviets obtained unique material, evidence of an aircraft project the Allies never saw. Aviation historians, who examined the lone still frame note several anomalies. The undercarriage appears reinforced, suggesting extreme takeoff weight. Exhaust plumes visible in the background suggest multiple thrust sources, not consistent with early Me-262 jets. One engineer speculated it was an attempt at mounting paired Heinkel He S-011 turbojets within a shared fuselage system. Others argued it could have been a prototype for a rocket-assisted interceptor designed to engage Allied bombers at high altitude. Either way, the scale of the engineering pointed to resources that should have been impossible in 1944-45, when the Reich was collapsing under relentless bombardment. The mystery deepened with the discovery of a Luftwaffe technical index from late 1944, recovered in Dresden in 1992. The index lists a project labeled NJP46 under the supervision of Messerschmitt's Augsburg facility. The entry, however, is marked with a double cross, meaning evacuated or destroyed. No design. Schematics accompany it. Scholars who compared the index with the film still concluded the codename matched the aircraft shown. But how could such a prototype have reached flight testing without Allied detection? No eyewitness reports from Allied pilots mention such a craft. Local testimony offers tantalizing fragments. In 1947, a Czech farmer from the outskirts of Plzeň told investigators he had once seen a machine with two bodies joined like a ladder fly low over the fields during a storm. He claimed it left behind scorched grass where it passed. His statement was filed and forgotten until resurfacing in the 1990s alongside the Nachtjäger film. A former Soviet mechanic stationed in Prague in 1945 also recalled being ordered to escort two large crates, heavier than tanks, onto a train bound for Smolensk. He never learned what was inside, only that they were guarded by officers who spoke German rather than Russian. What became of the film after its transfer to Moscow is uncertain. Requests by researchers in the early 2000s to view the reel were denied, with officials claiming the nitrate film had degraded beyond recovery. Yet rumors persist that select military engineers in the 1960s studied Nachtjägerprojekt designs as part of early Soviet jet development. The MiG-25, with its twin-engine layout and heavy reinforced fuselage, has occasionally been cited as inheriting conceptual DNA from such studies. Officially, however, Russian aviation histories make no mention of German twin fuselage experiments, beyond the well-known Messerschmitt P1101 and Horten projects. The single surviving still frame, stored today in a sealed archive in Berlin, shows the The aircraft on a snow-covered runway, floodlights glaring across its metallic surface. The markings on its tail are deliberately obscured, either painted over or scratched from the film itself. Analysts note the unusual landing gear, positioned wide apart under each fuselage, unlike any wartime German aircraft. The presence of technicians in heavy coats suggests the test was filmed in winter, perhaps early 1945, when Luftwaffe desperation reached its peak. The absence of documentation is as telling as what survives. Allied post-war interrogations of German aerospace engineers contain no references to a Nachtjägerprojekt. Neither Messerschmitt nor Heinkel designers admitted under Operation Paperclip or Soviet-equivalent programs to working on such a craft. This silence raises two possibilities. Either the project was so compartmentalized that only a handful of engineers knew of it, or it never truly existed. Its film a staged deception for propaganda. Yet if it were a hoax, why would the Soviets guard the real so carefully for decades? For now, the Nachtjäger film remains one of the great enigmas of aviation history. A 6-minute fragment, vanishing into archives, surfacing only long enough to leave behind a single, blurred image. Was it proof that the Third Reich had reached beyond known technology, testing weapons years ahead of their time? Or was it an elaborate illusion, preserved to sow doubt among enemies and allies alike? The answer lies in a reel of nitrate film that may no longer exist, or perhaps exists too securely to ever see daylight again. The wars we remember are only half the story. The rest lies hidden in scorched tunnels, in blacked-out files, in rumors silenced before they became testimony. What was destroyed, what was stolen, and what remains locked away are reminders that history is not only written, it is censored. And in the spaces where memory is denied, shadows gather, whispering of secrets still too dangerous to name aloud.